Well, today we're going to be kicking off a brand new series studying the last, by 12 chapters of the book of Genesis. It's a story that follows a very dysfunctional family. Joseph, his 11 brothers, their father, Jacob. And what's interesting is this is part of the chosen family that God would use to establish the bloodline of Jesus. So like this family that we're about to talk about, there's divorce, there's sex, there's human trafficking. It is a rough series that we're about to go through. But despite all that, God still uses this family with all their mess to become a nation that Jesus himself would come from. So if you look at Genesis as one big grand narrative, it's not just a history book. And sometimes in Sunday school, it gets kind of dumbed down to just our origin story. And while there is great history to be learned from the book of Genesis, it's much more about who God is and his desire to partner with broken people like you and I. And in these ancient scrolls, they didn't have chapters and verses like we do in our text today. And so they use these other writing techniques to bring about certain emphases. Like when you see something that's repetitive or you feel like history is repeating itself, there's a lesson we're supposed to learn there. And so in this story of Joseph, you're going to see some parallels even with Adam and Eve and their two sons, Cain and Abel. You see, Cain and Abel dealt with jealousy that turned into rage, that turned into murder. Joseph and his brothers had a very similar theme. Adam and Eve were exiled from Eden, God's design, God's place for them. Joseph would eventually be exiled from his family in the promised land as well. And so anytime you see these parallel themes that are happening, it's worth leaning in and digging in just a little bit beneath the surface. Because what we're going to see is a God who's very interested in reconciling and partnering with broken people to reach broken people. See, Joseph's lineage comes from Father Abraham. If you grew up in church, you can kind of know the choreography to Father Abraham having many sons. Well, he had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. And the covenant that God established with this family is that every nation on earth would be blessed through him. And what we're going to see here is that God, while he may not be the author of some of the struggles that we're about to see, specifically the relational struggles that we're going to see inside this chosen family, he absolutely authorizes some adversity, some challenges. And in his sovereignty allows those challenges to position us and refine us to be used by God to share a story of grace, new beginnings, and second chances. So what I want you to do as we read this passage in Genesis chapter 37 together is do more than just glance over it like it's a Bible history class. Put yourself in the shoes of this cast of characters. We're going to cover some things that should be moving, that should be gripping, that should be challenging, because what I know is that we've all got our varying degrees of dysfunction with our group of friends, with our work friends, with our significant other, with our kids. There's no perfect people. That means there's no perfect relationships. And what we're going to do over the next few weeks leading into Easter is look at some of the relational dynamics that happened and how God used even a dysfunctional family to secure the bloodline of Jesus. It's pretty powerful stuff. Allow the Holy Spirit to reveal some of the problems that exist inside the relationships that God has entrusted into you. The temptation is going to be when we talk about drama, when we talk about conflict, when we talk about tension, you'll want to maybe elbow the rib cage of the person sitting next to you, or if not that, you're at least thinking, I sure am glad he's here for this because, but let me challenge you. What if this is for you too? Listen, I know what I'm capable of. I know the tendency toward toxicity that I have in my own life, right? We've all got issues that when things aren't going well, that We can make mountains out of molehills. We can major in the minors and minor on the majors. And what often ends up happening is we're no longer fighting about disagreements, that we just fight about the way that we fight. Like to the dads in the room, we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth the drama that would ensue over the 1 or 2 degree difference that we're trying to maintain on the house thermostat? Yeah, you've been there. What about this to the married couples in the room? How big of an explosion happens in your household when your spouse watches ahead on Netflix? Ooh, yes, the silence is telling. The silence is telling. You know, when you're having a bad day, when things aren't going well in your relationship, something silly like where you squeeze toothpaste out of the tube can become a significant issue. And let me tell you what's cheaper than divorce: buying a second tube of toothpaste. There you go. You're welcome. That's the Castleberry solution to arguments. So these are all service level things, but if we're real and we're willing to maybe get real before the Spirit of truth, I think we're going to realize we've all got certain degrees of dysfunction in various relationships. And this sermon isn't just for the person sitting next to you. This sermon is for me. This sermon is for you. Because I think the relationships that exist inside the church should be something that just radiates healing and hope and reconciliation. So the story of Joseph picks up with a 17-year-old, 18-year-old young man, the youngest, next to the youngest of 12 brothers. And because Joseph was born toward the end of Jacob's life, we're told that Jacob really had a sense of preferential treatment toward Joseph. So that created some sibling rivalry between him and his older brothers. And we're told that Joseph would come and basically tattle on his brothers, that were, by the way, full-grown men. But in the ancient days, in kind of a more patriarchal, honor-shame society, you could get in trouble with your dad, even if he's in his hundreds and you're in your 50s. And so there was this tense rivalry that was happening between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph received this multicolored coat, which is this kind of symbol of honor, and all the treatment that should be reserved for the firstborn came to next to the last. And then Joseph gets these visions, these dreams from God about how his future is going to play out. And this future basically says that he's going to jump from 11th place to first place, and he's going to be the next patriarch. He's going to be the next leader, that his brothers are going to be bowing down to him one day. And so what does he do? Guess what God told me, guys? You ever tried to argue with somebody who plays the God card? And so these guys don't respond very well. It gets pretty brutal. So we're going to pick up in Genesis 37 on verse 8. And his brothers responded, "So, you think you will be our king? Do you actually think you will reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. And soon Joseph had another dream. And again, he told his brothers about it. "Listen, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down before me." And this time he told the dream to his father as well as his brothers, but his father scolded him. "What kind of dream is that? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you?" But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father also wondered what the dreams meant. So here's how the plot thickens. His brothers are moved to such a place of rage and jealousy over their brother that they kind of plot together to murder him and tell their dad that, maybe some animal ate him because they were a nomadic shepherding group of people. One of the brothers decides, maybe not, and so they decide to throw him in a pit while they decide what they're going to do with him. So eventually, some traders come by that are on their way to Egypt, and one of the brothers is like, "Let's just sell him into slavery. Human trafficking doesn't feel quite as bad as murder, right?" And so this whole thing spins out of control, all because of resentment. All because a young man who would eventually be used by God in a mighty way was not acting with humility. Now, did Joseph deserve this treatment? No, he did not. And if you're going through an abusive situation, there's nothing that you could do that would warrant you to be a victim. We all need to be willing to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, though, what might I be doing to contribute instead of alleviate the tension that is happening here at home? In all of my years of ministry, I've never met anyone who admits to struggling with pride until it's almost too late. No one has ever said, you know what? I'm feeling a little arrogant today, so please pray for me. But here Joseph is talking about how he's going to be the boss. That kind of pride is easy to identify. It's kind of the active version of pride, but I want you to know that there is a passive form of pride that sneaks into our relationships and is very elusive and very hard to identify. It's a more passive version of pride that is much more rooted in insecurity. And I think while you may not be the person who's like, look at me, look at me, look at me, you might be the person who's asking, well, quietly in the background, what about me? Do I matter? Are my needs going to be met? You see, pride can look like this. It can be both self-promoting and self-promoting, self-preserving. See, it's easier to identify the self-promotion version of pride. It's when confidence becomes cockiness, right? But the passive version of pride is very worried about, are people going to see me? Are people going to notice me? And it ends up prioritizing my needs above the needs of the people in my life. And Paul would tell us later in the book of Philippians that we're called to look to the needs of others and put them before our own. And the beautiful thing about that is if we are in that kind of a relationship, you're in this great reciprocity where you are with people, family and friends who are not so worried about themselves that they become neglectful of you. And so whether you are on more the self-promoting side of pride or the self-preserving side of pride, here's what we need to realize is that pride in our relationships, it attracts resentment. Pride brings about resentment. And while we cannot understate the horrors of what Joseph must have lived through, half of his brothers wanting to kill him, the other half of his brothers wanting to sell him into slavery, while those are terrible things, those really are symptoms of the brothers' resentment. And what the Bible is cluing us into is what can happen in our relationships if resentment goes unchecked. If bitterness takes hold and plants seeds in our heart and we find ourselves withholding forgiveness. I don't know that if Joseph and his brothers were to show up on a talk show with Dr. Phil that he'd be like, guys, it'd be really great if you could kind of tone down your murderer vibes a little bit. I think that'd really help out things around the house. But see, isn't it easy to deal with the symptoms of our relational drama? I don't like it when you talk to me that way. Like so many of the self-help books out there are just about how to make things a little bit more manageable. But I can tell you pastorally, sitting down with some of you in this very room at coffee shops, when we start talking about what's happening in your life right now, with just a couple of questions, just drilling a little bit deeper, there's unhealed wounds from the past that are significantly influencing how we treat people in our present. We have to recognize our capacity for bitterness, our capacity to hold on to unhealed wounds. And we have to be willing to look in the mirror and ask myself, things that are kind of tense in my house, is there anything that maybe I'm doing that is attributing to that? And is there anything that I could be doing that would alleviate that? And if we really want to alleviate the tension and the resentment and the drama, it means we're going to have to dig deep and examine where those unhealed wounds are and invite God into that process and replace our resentment, as we're going to see here in the book of Ephesians, with something that is a much more powerful force, a much greater change agent, something that can reinvent the entire emotional ecosystem at home, at work, among our group of friends. And we find this principle all the way in the New Testament. The book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul has some simple but not easy advice for those of us who are navigating tension, drama, conflict, resentment in our relationships. In Ephesians chapter 4, it says this: get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. So first off, he's saying identify it and get rid of it. We got to get rid of the trash that is cluttering up our emotional house. There's no place for that here. If we've been the recipient of forgiveness, then who are we to withhold that from the people in our lives? And it continues in verse 32. It says, instead, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. Listen, we are in human relationships, which mean we're going to have some human problems, right? You're bringing your scars into this relationship. I'm bringing my scars into this relationship. You're bringing kind of your ethos, your value system, your relational reference points from your family of origin. And they might be different than your loved ones. And it could be something as simple as, do the forks go upside down or right side up? I don't know. We can talk about that at a counseling session later, as I'm sure it's a hot button issue in many households. No, just mine? Okay. But the idea is that conflict is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Just because you have conflict in your relationship doesn't mean that you have necessarily a toxic relationship. It means you have a human relationship. So the first thing I think we can do is maybe give ourselves and the person sitting next to us a little bit of grace. Recognizing that, man, you've heard this platitude before. Conflict is inevitable, but drama is a choice. The presence of conflict doesn't mean that your relationship is doomed, right? But how we handle that conflict has the potential to bring about healing or to bring about harm. So what is Ephesians telling us? He wouldn't be telling us to get rid of all this bitterness and all this rage and all this wrath unless there was the possibility of that happening in our relationships. But thank God he doesn't tell us just to remove it. He tells us that we can also replace it. So here's what I want you to know. With this umbrella of grace over your relationships, you may not always be able to prevent resentment, but you can remove it. And he tells us here in Ephesians 4, verse 32, how we are called to remove the resentment from our heart. How to not be withholding. And it says, be tenderhearted, be loving, be gracious. It means we have to be Christ-like. It doesn't mean, if you're like me, a little bit of an aversion to conflict. Sometimes I can apologize so quickly that it makes the situation worse because Erica's like, you don't mean that, right? It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that we're just quick to apologize. It means that we're going to not just remove our resentment, but it means we're going to replace it with something much more powerful. I believe that the best way to remove a resentment is to replace it with mercy. And what's powerful about these words in verse 32, tenderheartedness, mercy, grace, love. The word for tenderhearted actually was a synonym in the ancient Greek for, get this, strong bowels. I think Paul is telling us that, hey, mercy, it's a difficult pill to swallow, right? Mercy is a difficult pill to swallow because what it means is I'm letting you off the hook. Doesn't mean I'm going to lie. Like, this situation is not okay. Like, I am hurt by this, but I'm not going to be the scorekeeper. Because love, 1 Corinthians 13 keeps no record of wrong. It means that we might have a little bit of heartburn stomaching the words, I forgive you, I release you. But we know it's going to be worth it. For those of you who maybe have struggled with acid reflux, you know what I'm talking about. When you've got that food that you know is going to keep you up at night, but you just love it so much anyways, you're going to take the Prilosec and do the preventative measures to kind of mitigate the risk. We have to ask ourselves, can I stomach this? Treating this person the way that Jesus has treated me, regardless of how this person is treating me. We've heard it said before that for everybody else, we're like, justice for their sins, but, mercy for mine. We tend to evaluate our life based off of our good intentions, but everybody else's life on their behavior. We're quick to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt and think, they should know I was having a bad day. Why can't they just give me a break? But God tells us that he delights in mercy over justice because, listen, justice is on God, but mercy is on me. Here's what I mean. Jesus took justice so seriously that he gave his life for justice to be served. So the score has been settled for the hurt and the pain that is in our lives. Jesus loves them and has forgiven them, and he's giving us a chance to do the same. So if we can release the need to be right, if we can release what we believe is kind of the privilege of getting the last word in, if we can entrust our sense of right and wrong and justice into the hands of God, who is a much more righteous and fair judge than I am, and choose mercy, then just maybe we will see the healing that we've been longing for. What that is called is humility. Humility means I'm going to put your needs before mine. Humility means that I take this relationship very seriously, but I'm not going to take myself too seriously. I'm going to be honest about the difference between essentials and extras, right? I'm going to be honest about what's a preference versus what is an actual need. I'm not going to be so quick to jump and pounce. I'm going to look in the mirror first and wonder what's going on in my life that's causing me to react this way. And if we had more followers of Jesus who treated their kids that way and their spouse that way and their coworkers that way, then maybe reconciliation would be more of an option, more of a reality. That sounds amazing, right? All of us want more of that. Well, the truth is humility attracts healing. And if we want to see God bring about healing in our life, if we want to protect ourselves from the effects of resentment, if we want to see God rebuild our families, it's going to take humility and trust. So just a couple of thoughts on maybe some next steps that we could all take. You know me, I'm always an advocate for counseling. I'm always an advocate for getting somebody in the mix of the conversation. to kind of help translate and unpack and untie some of those knots that are in our relationships. And if you need help identifying some great biblically based counselors and therapists in the community, man, I've got you. Find me at the pin drop afterward. For some of us today, it just means that before we go to lunch, on the way to lunch, that we need to ask the people in the car, how are you doing really? It might mean that at dinner time we start talking about highs and lows and just creating a safe place to share feelings, and that might feel a little bit foreign to some of us. But when we crack open the door for authenticity, we're allowed to begin to empathize and recognize some of the unmet needs in the relationships and some of the unhealed wounds. And you might be realizing that God has put you in your family's life, in a coworker's life, in a friend's life to be that agent of change. The story of Joseph is going to result in reconciliation, but it's going to take over a decade of separation, isolation, and rebuilding on his own with the help of God. And we're going to see that God was with Joseph every step of the way. And the power in this end of Genesis is how God can use all things, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to bring about hope and healing, even salvation. But we have to figure out, what part are we going to play? Who are we going to be in the relationships that God has entrusted into us? The people that are holding on to past pain and past grudges, or the people that replace our resentment with mercy? The ball's in your court. Healing is an option. Humility attracts healing. What do we want for our homes? What do we want for our groups of friends? What do we want our relationships to look like? I want people, when they see the marriages and the friends and the people that are doing lunch together, hanging out the meal together, when they find out where we go to church and they see this love and this tenderness and this graciousness, that they're like, oh yeah, that's those local folks. They really have got each other's back. We love because he first loved us. So let's figure out how to do that with humility for one another. Amen.